Hi, this is Mike, Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and today's video we'll be taking a look at Gigabyte's micro ATX motherboard for the B450 chipset. This is the B450M DS3H version 2. Is it any better? Let's find out. Okay, so in today's video we'll be taking a look at Gigabyte's B450M DS3H V2. This is an upgraded version of the original DS3H, which was extremely popular amongst the budget-minded folk out there who are trying to build cost-effective systems without blowing the budget and without having all those extra frills that a lot of you don't actually need. So what they've done with this particular version is there is actually a very subtle difference, but it is quite an important one. What they've done is taken the original VRM setup from the original DS3H, which was a kind of hybrid digital and analog VRM, whereas now on this one they've got an updated 4+2 fully digital VRM. So for most of you that probably doesn't mean a great deal, but essentially what it means is with a fully digital VRM, it's considerably more accurate when it comes to things like precision boost overclocking and also manual overclocking. Now, rather than having to use an offset against the original analog, you can now just put in the manual details. So if you want to put an extra bit of voltage into the RAM or into the CPU or the SoC, you can do all that straight away. Just type in the digital reference and it will do it. Whereas previously you'd need to do an offset against the original values, which for some people worked out okay, but with a digital system, it's basically just far more accurate and therefore much more reliable. Really, other than that particular difference, the board, the setup, everything else is exactly the same. There are no differences in the specification. The one possible thing you may say is now it supports DDR4 3600 directly, whereas previously, most of the time it was DDR 3200, maybe 3466 if you're lucky, but now it does have actually baked in full support in OC mode for DDR4 3600, which is fantastic if you're planning on using one of the second gen or Zen 2 processors from the AMD range. This means you can have a really good, tidy interface between the memory bus and also the Infinity fabric. So that's enough about the board itself. Let's take a look at the actual packaging itself, take the board out, go through the specs, features, etc. And then I'll come back with my final thoughts at the end of the video. And before we actually get into that, let's talk about pricing. So pricing obviously changes on a very rapid basis. This board here in the UK can be picked up anywhere between £50 and £70 depending where you shop. So obviously do look out for a bargain. We will be putting some affiliated links in the video description, but do check things like PC Part Picker, etc. to find the best price locally. So looking at the packaging, first of all, as you can see, Gigabyte obviously, and this is part of their ultra durable design range. So this is kind of like designed to last a long time. It isn't specifically for gamers and for hardcore overclockers, that kind of thing. Obviously that is reflected in the feature set and the pricing. But for most people building a moderate system, this is going to be a nice, stable, long-living board. Also on the front, you can see there it says directly supported the AMD Ryzen 3000 processor range. This will actually support the 5000 series range as well with a BIOS update. Generally, this board will come with version F1 BIOS. If you want to upgrade to the 5000 series, then you can install the F60 or F61 BIOSes at the time of the video review. If you want to see how to actually update the BIOS on this, then click on the links up here and there will be a follow-up video to show you how to do all that. Other features, obviously, B450 chipset. So this is kind of a mid-range chipset. It's a slight step up from the A320, but not quite as feature-packed as you'd see in things like the B550 and also the X570. I often miss out the X470 boards in this, really, because between X470 and X570, there generally isn't a huge amount of price difference, but certainly if you've got the option for those and you've got a little bit more budget, then those sometimes do work out a little bit better and often have a slightly better feature set. On the side of the box, you've got the details again and also some of the more specifics about the actual serial numbers and model numbers, etc. And on the back, it goes into more details about the individual features. So you've got a picture of the motherboard, you've got the full specifications there, which I'll give you a close-up of now. Also, there is a QR code which you can scan. I'll put that on the screen as well, so if you want to quickly scan that with your phone, feel free to do so, and that'll take you to the products page on the Gigabyte website. Also, it says about the 4+2 phase digital VRM solution, as we discussed earlier. So this is an upgraded over the 4+3 analog or hybrid digital analog setup that they had previously. Also, you've got Speed Fan 5, so there is actually 5 temperature sensors all around the motherboard to pick up certain temperatures. So you've got ones for like the VRM, the processor, graphics card, etc, etc. So you can go in and make changes to your fan system accordingly. The fan system is one of the slight weaknesses of this board. There are only 2 fan headers, both of which are fully adaptable between CPU, water pump, or whatever you choose to hook up to them. But there is only 2, so one of them is effectively your CPU header, the other one is for your chassis fans. Now this isn't the end of the road, because you can quite easily add a separate hub or a splitter to enable you to use more fans on the board if you need to. But as it comes out of the box, it will only support physically 2 fans. Also, as this is PCI Express Generation 3, or at least partially, you have got M.2 support for NVMe drives up to ×4 speeds. The port itself is actually backwards compatible as well, so you can use it with SATA based M.2 drives also, but that will only give you SATA 6 gigabit per second speeds. It does discuss about the long life capacitors used on the board. These are becoming pretty commonplace on most boards these days, so it's not really an extra feature, it's more something that we would expect these days. And it also goes on to mention about RGB. Now RGB is going to be one of those things which obviously you either love it or you hate it. This board actually only supports a limited version of RGB, which is the old traditional 12 volt system, and will provide you up to 7 different colors actually from the software or from the board itself. So yeah, it's not fully featured. Technically, I would say yes, it supports RGB, but it is a very limited implementation. Also, it shows you the layout of the I/O on the back, which again is relatively limited, but we do have a decent splash of USB ports on there, so should be enough to cater for most people. Also, one of their taglines, which always makes me smile, is no lag, just frag. So this is using the Gigabyte 8118 chipset for gigabit Ethernet, also backwards compatible 10100, etc. Not the best solution for Ethernet, but certainly will get the job done. So that's enough about the specs. Let's take it out of the box and see what we actually get. And spoiler alert, it isn't a lot. So first of all, you get a pair of SATA cables. So again, SATA 3 or 6 gigabit per second connections, one of which is a straight cable, one of which has a 90-degree right angle. Next, we have the motherboard itself, which we'll put to one side for now. There is a multi-language installation guide, a very brief user manual, which goes through the very basics. There is a driver DVD with all the latest, well, not really the latest, basically it's got drivers on for the motherboard. And also we get a leaflet in French. No idea. Last up is the I/O shield. Obviously, being this is a budget orientated board, it doesn't have an integrated I/O shield, and again, it is a very basic one, just the traditional old kind of stainless steel that we're used to seeing. So that takes us to the actual motherboard itself, and as you can see, this is a micro ATX board, so it is pretty tiny and should fit into most builds. There's no exceptional width to this one at all. Again, we'll put some measurements on the screen now so you can see exactly how big it is. So this is going to be fine for most setups. If you're using something like an APU, like a 3400G, 2200G, that kind of thing is absolutely fine. It's not obviously recommended for the latest and greatest processors, although technically a 5950 is supported, and on the website it does say it's supported. Obviously overclocking of that chip would be seriously hindered by the lacking VRM and the cooling solution. But certainly if you're not looking to overclock at all, those processors will be absolutely fine. Although, obviously, like I said, there are better boards out there. So let's take a tour of the board itself and go through all of the sockets. So in this top corner, we've got the 8-pin supplementary CPU power, which is, again, nice to see. Quite often on these kind of budget-orientated boards, you'd normally have a 4-pin there. So at least with the 8-pin, you are going to get a little bit more juice through to the CPU. Moving down, we've got the VRM selection here. Again, it's a 4+2 setup, and there is a reasonably good heatsink on there, so the actual VRM isn't going to get overly toasty. Now, I have seen some tests between this particular board and the original version, the one with the hybrid VRM, and realistically you're looking at about a 10 to 15 degrees drop in temperatures of the V2 over the original board. So again, that is going to help you out with certain things like precision boost overclocking and just manual overclocking in general. So moving across, we've got our AM4 socket. Again, that supports pretty much all processors from the very first 1000 range, although you will need obviously a BIOS update for the 5000 series. That will be mostly depending on when and where you buy this particular board. Now, I'll be doing a separate follow-up video to this for BIOS updates, and actually at the time we'll see what BIOS revision this actually ships with. Really, it should be version F.1 or F1. It would be nice if the F60 was on there, which is the one which actually supports the 5000 series, but again, your mileage may vary depending on when and where you buy the board from. Moving along, we've got our CPU fan header at the top, which again is usable for water pumps, all that kind of stuff if you wanted to. I think realistically most people, with a board like this, you'll be just using either a stock cooler or maybe an aftermarket cooler, just plug straight in, no problems there. Next up, we've got our 4 RAM slots, which again, for micro ATX is great. Sometimes on A320s, we see 2 slots, which isn't great for upgrade paths. So this will support up to 128 gigabytes of RAM. That is using 32 gig sticks. Memory speed supported, anything from 2133 at the very lowest end, right the way up to the heady heights of DDR4 3600 on the higher end. Potentially, you may be able to get more than that out of the board, but that is all that is actually recommended on the site. Moving down on the board, you'll see we've got our 24-pin power connector, which is pretty usual to see there. Unfortunately, there's no kind of diagnostic LEDs on this board, so if you do have a problem with it not booting, there isn't any visual references other than what you'd get from possibly if you connected a speaker for BIOS bleeps, that kind of thing. So moving on down, we've got our SATA ports. So they've got 4 SATA ports on here, all of which supporting up to SATA 3 or 6 gigabit per second connections. Sometimes it's nice to see a few more ports on there, but I think 4 ports these days actually is going to be fine. You do have the option, again, of using the M.2 port at the top here, which supports both SATA type drives and also NVMe drives. Again, it is only PCI Express Gen 3 x 4 is the maximum throughput, and also depending on your processor, there may also be some limitations there, so do bear that in mind. Moving down, we've got our first of our PCI Express ports, and this is a Gen 3 x 16 port. So again, depending on the processor you install in here, that may be reduced down to X8 speeds. You can find out more details on the website. Again, we'll put some links in for that. Nice little heatsink here on the actual south bridge or the main chipset itself. These B450s generally don't get particularly hot anyway, so you shouldn't have any problems there whatsoever. Moving down to the bottom, we've got our system I/O panel connections. So there you've got things like your power button, reset button, etc, etc. Also above that, there is also a CMOS reset switch, which actually is quite a nice place to be, especially if you've potentially got a graphics card in here. The BIOS battery is going to be below that, so to reset the CMOS, realistically, the best option probably is going to be to reset the pins there. So that's in a very good place. Next up, USB 3.0 header ports, and next to that, there is a pair of USB 2.0 ports. Obviously there we've got our CMOS battery, and also there is a PCI Express Gen 2 x 1 port, and this bottom slot, which also looks like a x 16 slot, is unfortunately only PCI Express Gen 2 x 4 speeds. Technically you could run Crossfire or some kind of SLI setup on here, but realistically these days those don't make a great deal of sense. Performance isn't great and game support is very limited, so I would probably advise against it, but potentially if you're some kind of sadist, then certainly you're welcome to give it a go. Moving down to the very bottom now, so we've got a COM port header, so if you want to use an old-fashioned COM port, then you can connect up things to that, and also you've got your TPM port for trusted platform modules. Moving along, we've got our SpeedIF output, so if you want to use this in maybe a small HTPC sensor for media, movies, that kind of stuff, then you can hook up a SpeedIF output there, and next to that you've got your HD audio connection. The audio on this isn't fantastic, but certainly gets the job done. It will support up to 7.1, but you will need to reroute some of the audio ports from the front of the case, so if you're a front I/O panel, also using the ones at the back at the same time. So yeah, there's only 3 ports on the back, which we'll take a look at shortly. The capacitors on there for the audio setup are pretty decent, and there is also a separation track between the audio and the motherboard itself, so that hopefully should reduce some of the humming and kind of whining that we get in the background in some devices. Moving back up, we've got our 12 volt RGB header, so again, not addressable. This is purely 12 volt RGB and can give you a combination in software of 7 different colors. So yeah, not quite what you're used to, although if you just want to plug in a static strip and keep it one color, it's going to be absolutely fine. And moving up from that, we've got our only other fan header, which is a chassis fan header. Again, if you want to, you can connect up a splitter or some sort of hub and connect as many devices as you like from that hub. Before we go round to the rear I/O, just a quick look at the board overall. I'm not entirely sure how I like the design on here. It kind of reminds me somewhat of a Union Jack flag for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why. I guess it's the kind of angles going on here. Some people may like it, some people may not. The board itself has, as usual, got that kind of browny gold tinge to it, which I'll be honest with you, I'm not a particular fan of. But again, this is a no-frills board. It's designed to get you up and running for a limited amount of money with a limited amount of features. And by having the extra expense of a black PCB It's just one of those things that they felt wasn't necessary. So that takes us round to the rear I/O, and it's actually, again, a relatively sparse affair. So in the start here, we've got two USB 2.0 ports and also a combo keyboard mouse jack. You've got a DVI output, so if you're using an APU, you can use DVI, and that'll support up to 1920 by 200 at 60 Hz. Next up, you've got an HDMI 2.0 port, so again, up to 4K on there. I think it's around 30 Hz. Realistically, 4K for an APU is probably pushing things a little bit anyway, but certainly most devices, 1080p, 1440p, be absolutely fine at higher refresh rates. Next up, we've got two lots of USB 3.1 ports. Again, it's actually quite a decent USB setup here. You've got 8 ports in total, you've got another 2 USB 2.0 ports there. Moving along from there, we've also got our Ethernet jack, which is the Realtek 8118 chipset, which also supports LAN management, all that kind of stuff. Supports Gigabit, 10100, etc. So yeah, pretty much most bases covered there. You wouldn't really be expecting 2.5 gigabit LAN on this kind of board anyway. Last up, we've got our 3 audio jacks, so normal deal there, so microphone, headphone and line jacks. And that pretty much wraps up the board. On the back, usual kind of setup, so you've got the AMD standard backplate there for cooling purposes, and all of the chipset cooling is actually removable pretty easily with those squeeze pins. So if you wanted to, you can take those out and replace any thermal paste should you see the need. So that is pretty much it for the board. It is certainly a no frills board. It is very cost effective. If you can pick one up at a really good price, around about the £50–55 mark, you can put on something like a 2200G, 3400G, that kind of thing, and you can build yourself a nice little system which will actually play most modern games at lower resolutions, which is fantastic. At the moment on the market, there is a very, very limited amount of graphics cards. So if you can pick up something like a Ryzen 5 3400G, then yeah, that is going to be absolutely perfect with Vega 11 on there. You can get a really nice little cheap PC up and running, play your games, and not have to worry about trying to sell a kidney to buy yourself the modern graphics cards these days. So let's wrap this one up. Who is this board actually designed for? Well, cheapskates, obviously. Anyone who's trying to save a few quid, this makes a lot of sense. Not a huge amount of expandability, only one M.2 slot, only 4 SATA ports. It isn't a huge amount, but certainly for anyone building a quad core, a 6-core, 8-core, or possibly even a 12-core system on a budget, or maybe you just use it in an office and you're doing a bit of rendering, that kind of thing, or general office work, this is going to be absolutely fine. Even for gaming, with the new digital VRM, it is going to be a much better contender, especially in that lower range bracket. If you're looking to spend a little bit more money, then certainly there are other options, such as ASRock's B450 Pro 4, that kind of thing. That will give you a little bit more flexibility and a few more features like addressable RGB and a couple of extra ports on the board itself. But realistically, if you just want to get up and running and you just want to throw a chip on there, get going and not have to worry about all the other frills, then I think this actually makes a pretty decent option. And it's certainly better than the original version, which was the D3H version 1, which again has the analog VRM, which did get a little bit toasty. So this should do a much better job. So let me know what you think about this board in the comments section below. But in the meantime, I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.